Hi! Welcome back to another Mocktails and Masterpieces. My name is Emily and I'm a librarian here at Kent Free Library. Today we are going to be painting this beautiful koi fish in a serene looking pond. So if you're ready to get started, go ahead and grab your favorite drink and follow me. To begin, you're going to want to set up your painting area. I've already laid down a plastic tablecloth. I also have an easel here, and I've got our canvas on the easel oriented in a landscape direction. If you received one of the painting kits from the library, it will include 6 different colors of paint. Today we're going to be working with black, white, medium blue, Kelly green, orange, and yellow. If you didn't get a painting kit from the library, no worries. Just find some colors in your own acrylic stash that match these colors. You also should have received 2 brushes, one large, one small. Our canvas today is 8 by 10. But if you have a smaller or larger canvas, it should work fine. Just make sure you adjust the proportions to match the size of your canvas. In addition to these items, you're going to want to get a graphite pencil, a paper plate, or some other palette that you can mix your colors on, paper towels or rags to clean off your brushes, and a cup of fresh water. All right, let's get started. To begin, I'm going to start by sketching the basic outline of our koi fish and the lily ponds. This is going to help us know where to leave the canvas white once we start painting in our blue pond background. We're going to start with the blue of the water, and then we're going to add the foreground elements like the fish and the lily pads later on. So I'm sketching out the basic body of the fish. If you're not familiar with koi fish, and honestly any time that you're painting from real life, I recommend that you go ahead and find a reference photo from the internet or from your own photography to use. Whenever we're trying to paint realistically, it's always best to look at a picture of the object. Even when we're familiar with that animal or with that scenery, it's always best to draw or paint from real life if you want to be the most accurate. Once you're happy with the general outline of your fish, you can go ahead and start sketching in the lily pads. Now you can put these wherever you would like. You just want to make a balanced composition. So I'm going to be placing mine in areas where there's a lot of empty space relative to the fish, which is really the main focus point of this picture, of this painting. I think I'm going to add 2 lily pads, but you can add more or less if you'd like. And once you're happy with the composition, you know what, I think my fish is a little far to the left. I think to balance it out, I am going to add 1 more lily pad right here in the corner. Or maybe, yeah, I think I want it right there. Okay, once you're happy with the composition, go ahead and set down your pencil and pick up your first brush. I'm going to be starting with a large brush, and we're going to be painting in the blue of the water. So I'm going in and I'm laying down some of that medium blue, and right on the canvas I'm mixing in some white. And I'm using big, generous strokes, using a lot of paint. And you can see I'm kind of using the shape of my brush and the motion of my hand to suggest water and movement. I'm going in with some green now to create more of a teal color down here near the lily pads. And I'm going to be painting around the body of the fish, but over the fins and the tail of the fish. If you look back at your reference photo, I'll put mine on the screen. You can see that the fish's tails, koi fish, their tails and their fins are actually quite translucent. So in order to mimic that translucency, I'm going to paint the water underneath the fins. And then I'm going to come back in once that water's dried with a very light amount of white and apply it very thinly over top to get that translucent appearance. I'll show you more how to do that once we get to that stage of the painting, but for now just know that we're painting around the body of the fish, leaving the body of the fish white, and we're filling in where the fins and the tail are. So that looks nice. I'm going to transition back into more of a blue color. Oh, and you can see I've already painted over where I said that first lily pad was going to be, so I guess that's not happening. You could, by all means, if you make a mistake like that, it's up to you. You could choose to go in and try to paint over that green, or paint over the blue with some green. I'm just going to say it wasn't meant to be and leave it as water. I think that's what we call a happy little accident, right? We'll just keep going. So yeah, we're just filling in the entire canvas with a nice blue teal color, mixing in white and green alternatively as we go. And if you're using a stretched canvas that has, we're using like flat canvases today in your kits, that's what they came with. But if you have a stretched canvas, make sure you're painting the edges of your canvas. You always want to make sure that you paint to the very edges of the piece, and that you're also including the sides of the canvas as part of your work. Seeing that bright white of the canvas, even on the edges, can just be very jarring and sort of take you out of the illusion of the painting. So I always recommend that you paint the edges. Working some of that green back up into the blue, and then putting more blue on top of the green, just trying to get that nice teal color, something that resembles water in a pond. And the less you mix the paint, the more you kind of just leave it on the painting, the more texture you're going to get. If you want something that looks a little smoother, by all means, keep working it and smoothing it out. But I kind of like the texture that we get when we use a lot of paint in these dabbing motions, because I think to me it really gives the illusion of water. So we're painting up and around the tail of the fish, but again, just leaving that body white. And the reason we're leaving it white is because it's going to be a little bit more difficult to come back in. The fish is going to eventually be white, so if we keep the canvas white, it will be easier to get that shade later on. And you want to make sure you paint up into the lily pad where the cutout is. If you have that cutout drawn on your canvas, you want to paint into it. And I think we're just about done here. Now we can always come in and clean up these edges of the fish's body later with some white. I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to come back down here and paint in, like I said, that V for the lily pad. Yeah, that's looking pretty good to me. That's a good start. We can and probably will come and touch up this water later, but for now we've got a good kind of teal colored turquoise base to start. So I'm going to grab my water, clean off my brush, and I'll be right back. The next thing we want to do is paint in the shadows. So we want to give the illusion that the lily pad, they are floating on the top, the surface of the water, and that the fish is swimming somewhere, you know, not near the bottom or on the bottom of the lake, but kind of in between the surface and the bottom of the pond. And in order to do this, we want to paint in shadows beneath the objects. So on our palette, we're going to mix a darker shade of blue. I'm going to go in and take some of the blue, and then I'm going to take some of the black and maybe a little bit of green to kind of get just a darker shade of the water. And once you have that color mixed up, you can go back onto the canvas and just paint in those shadows. You want to make sure that the shadows, if you think of there being one source of light in this painting, typically that's going to be the sun in a realistic outdoor painting like this. The sun is in one spot, which means all the shadows should be lined up and going in the same direction relative to the object that they're falling under. So I'm going to put my shadows, I think I'm going to put them a little bit up and to the left of the objects. So the fish's shadow, and maybe a little behind. So I'm just going to start painting, and hopefully you get the idea of what I'm trying to explain here. But the fish's shadow is going to start just a little bit above and to the left of the fish. And we're going to try to mimic the same shape as the fish's body. And fins, even though we haven't left a space for the fins, remember the shape that you sketched when you started your painting. Try to, mimic the shape that you initially wanted to see. So this is the body of the fish, going in with this kind of gray, just darker blue color. And again, it's all right if you get a little bit of this color on the body of the fish. We are going to be painting the fish with white later on, so we can go in and clean up those edges. So that's good for the body. Now the fish's shadow is going to be a little bit smaller than the fish itself, because if you think about the fish being closer to us than the shadow in this sort of stacked perspective. And then we're going to put in the fins, the tail fins here. Just real simple shapes. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but remember, whatever shape you make for the fins and the tail, you will need to copy that later. So you're kind of locking yourself into this shape right now. And then here we have the fins. All right, so there's the fish. And then down here we'll make the same sort of shadow for the lily pad. And again, if this shadow was up and to the left, the lily pad shadow is also going to be up and to the left. So we'll paint it. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more green because you can see the water down here is a little bit more teal than the water up here. And we want the shadow to look like it belongs in this part of the pond. Maybe went a little too green. There we go. That's perfect. And we're leaving a space for the wedge, shifting the wedge slightly up and to the left, just like we did the rest of the lily pad as we painted shadow. And again, don't be afraid of painting into the edges. It's better to paint too much right now than to leave white spaces where we don't want white spaces, because we can always come back in this case in the green, and clean up those edges. Looking good? And if you think of the shadows as going up and to the left, then you'll know for this top lily pad we will not need a shadow, because that shadow would actually be falling outside of the view of our canvas. I'm just making this a little bit darker. I want a better contrast between the water and the shadow here. That's looking pretty good. Okay, I'm gonna clean off my brush again. The next thing we're gonna paint is the lily pads themselves. So these are gonna be green. And I'm going to use, we've got a nice Kelly green on our palette today. I think for the main color of the lily pads themselves, I'm gonna mix it with a little bit of yellow to get more of a sap green. So a little bit of yellow and maybe a little bit of white in there. And just using a lighter version of this green is going to give us the option to come back in later on and paint darker details like veins and shadows on the lily pad itself. So I'm just using my big brush and I'm painting in the general shape of our lily pad, making sure to leave that V in between these two leaves. As always, when we're painting from life, it can be really helpful to have a reference photo. Once again, I can put a reference photo on screen right now for you to look at. And we can take all sorts of different cues from reference photos. We can look at colors, we can look at shadows and lighting, we can look at details and texture. Reference photos are good for so many different aspects. They just help you get a really realistic looking subject, if that's what you're going for. But even if you're painting something from fantasy or a subject that's kind of completely made up, you still want to ground that in something real. So even then, reference photos can be helpful to understand the way light and physics interplay with different textures and objects. So that's good for our top one. Just going to come in and paint this smaller lily pad here. All right, I am noticing that these lily pads, even though I did darken the color on our palette, to me the contrast between the shadow of the lily pad and the shadow of the lily pad and the lily pad itself, it's just not very noticeable. So I'm going to come in with a lighter shade of green for the base. We're just going to add even more yellow and more white to that initial color, and hopefully that makes it stand out a little bit more against the background of the pond and the shadow that we painted earlier. When we talk about contrast in paintings, we want to talk about not just the contrast of colors. Obviously the blue and the green are different colors. We also want to talk about contrasting values. So the value of a color is how dark it is. And when we paint things that are next to each other, we can make them stand out or pop more by increasing the value contrast. In this instance, we're coming in with a lighter shade of green that's going to contrast more against the dark blue of the shadow and the water, and hopefully just make it easier to see that lily pad that we painted, especially the one down here in the bottom. Yeah, already I'm liking how that looks a lot better. One great way to test the values in your painting, just to make sure that you have good contrast and that you're using the full range of values available to you, is to take a photo of your painting and then set it to black and white mode. Once you remove all the color, it's very easy to see where your values lie in the painting. And from there you can go ahead and go back in, touch things up, adjust things if you need to. But yeah, that's looking pretty good to me. So we've got our shadows, our water, and our lily pads in. The next thing we're going to do is paint the body of the fish. I told you before, one reason that we're going in with, I know that the canvas is already white, but we're going to go in and paint it white again. First of all, just to clean up these edges, but also to give us a nice paint base that we can blend and paint into using that wet on wet technique that we talked about in our last video. That's just going to give us more options when it comes to painting different textures. Also, again with shading, if you look at our reference photo of our fish, today we're going to be painting a white fish with orange markings. So you can see that the whitest white of the fish is on the highlights of its scales. The entire body isn't that same bright, vibrant white. So in order to get those highlights, again, we're talking about contrast here, in order to save that really bright white for the top of the fish, we want to start painting the base of the fish, the body of the fish, with a slightly darker gray color. I think you'll be surprised. Once we start laying it on, it's going to look pretty gray, but once we get it completely painted and we have covered that initial white of the canvas, you'll see it's going to look very close to true white. I think you'll be surprised. So we are coming in with a cool white color. If you're wondering, I was mixing this on the palette as we talked about the highlights on the scales, but I made this color using a lot of white, a little bit of blue, and just a touch of orange. We put the orange in to tone this color to make it more gray. If we didn't use the orange, it would have been a very saturated, almost baby blue. The orange, when we add the orange with the blue in there, it pulls it back closer to a neutral gray. Now it's still a cool gray, but it's not as blue as it would have been without the orange. So there we go. We've got a nice gray, cool gray base for our fish. I'm going to add a little bit more paint near the edges, just so that we make sure that none of that excess pond that we painted before, none of that extra blue is showing in. And we did pick up a little bit of blue from the pond water. We could try to blend that in. We could also clean off our brush and try to wipe that away, which is what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to pull that color and just dab it off on my paper towel. It's not working so great. I might try to cover it up. That's working a little better. We could also let this dry and then come back and paint over it later, but I think that looks pretty good for now. So there's the body of our fish, painted in that cool gray. All right, now that we have the base color layered on, we are going to add the orange scales to our fish. So I'm going to go ahead and put down my large brush. This part we're going to go in with our smaller brush. Again, you should have had 2 brushes in your kit. This is the smaller of the 2 that we're using now. So depending on your reference photo, you just want to kind of look at that and use that to gauge the color of scales you want on your fish. Koi fish come in all different colors. Like I said, the one I'm painting today is white with orange, but you'll find, you know, black and orange, black and white, even some like red and golden color fish. So really, feel free to be creative here with the colors. If you want to follow along with me exactly, that's no problem, but as always, feel free to explore and follow your own creative leanings. So I'm just going to take kind of a medium orange here. I made this color by adding yellow to our orange. And using this medium color to start with, it just leaves me a lot of room to go back in with darker orange or lighter kind of golden scales later on when it comes time to add highlights and create a sense of depth on our fish. But I'm going to go ahead and, with tiny strokes, little dabbing motions, I'm going to start adding the orange to our fish. Okay. Looking very bright. Now again, we can always go back in and clean up if we get a little bit of orange outside of the body of our fish. It's easier just to be careful when we're painting and try to stay inside the lines, but you know, accidents are going to happen, so don't be too worried if you paint outside of your fish. We can go back and clean it up later. Oh, like I did just now. So all I'm doing right now is I'm just scratching that color out with the back of my brush, which is possible because our water has dried now. If that was still wet, we could have tried to like blend it in just with a tapping motion to make it kind of disappear into the background. But now that it's dry, this scratching motion, we can just lightly scratch it off the surface of that dry paint without too much trouble. Okay. I'm trying to be bold with my color choices here, so I'm trying not to cringe too much at how bright this orange is. But if the orange that you're putting down is a little bit too neon for your taste, again, we can tone that color. We can introduce shades of gray and kind of cut back the saturation by adding the complementary color. So if you want a slightly less vibrant, saturated shade of orange for your fish's scales, what you can do is just add a tiny touch of that blue, that medium blue on our palette, to your orange. Mix that up, and that will give you a slightly less neon shade for your fish. But I am just about done here with these scales. I think maybe 1 or 2 more spots, and we will be good to go. Now I'm sort of looking at the reference image to get the placement of these scales, but every fish is different. I think these are a little bit like zebra stripes in that way. You can be creative and make up a pattern as you go, and I'm sure whatever you paint, there's a fish out there somewhere that looks like that. If you're wondering, I couldn't be bold. I couldn't do it. I'm going back in with a slightly toned, so more blue version of this orange, and I'm just cutting back that saturation a bit. It was a little bit too much for me. All right, and that's a good start for our fish. Got some nice orange laid down in a medium shade that we can go back in with darker and lighter colors to highlight later. All right, so that's exactly what we're going to do next. We're going to create a slightly darker shade of orange, and we're going to stipple this color around the edge of our fish. So to get a darker orange, I'm using just orange, no yellow this time, and I'm mixing it with a little bit of that blue. Now blue, again, is a great color for orange when we want to tone things, but blue is also great for darkening colors, especially for shadow work. Typically, color theory suggests that the shadowed part of our images should be cooler in tone, and cold colors are just colors that have more blue in them. And the lighter parts of our image should be warmer in tone. So a warm color is something that has been shaded with red. It has more red tones in it. So you'll see I've mixed up that darker orange, and we're going to go ahead and just lightly stipple this around the edge of our fish. And this is going to give us the illusion of depth. If you think about a fish's body, it is curved, kind of like, banana shaped. And so the part of the fish that's closest to us is the top dorsal line of the fish. And as it curves back down towards the bottom of the ocean floor, the edges get further away from us. And all this means is that the parts of the fish that are near the edge are going to be darker than the part of the fish that is closest to us and closest to the light source. So we want to put our shadows on the edge of the fish, and then when we highlight later on, we'll be clustering those highlights closest to this dorsal line of the fish. And again, I'm using a stippling motion here. I'm not using long strokes because I want to create a textured look that sort of invokes scales. We'll come back in and do a little bit more detailed work later. That'll be one of the last things we do. And we'll actually paint scales onto the fish. But we can even start to encourage and help that process along now by being mindful about the shape of our paint strokes, even at this early stage. So that looks pretty good to me. We've got some darker edges to our scales. Now we're going to go in and we're going to add that lighter gold color, like I said, up towards the dorsal line, so the very middle of the fish, where it's going to be closest to the water and closest to our light source. So to create this light highlight color, we're going to add yellow to our orange, a lot of yellow, to create, you know, kind of a golden marigold color. And we're just going to add that to the innermost pieces of our scale pattern. I'm not adding any white to this color. I may come back in later to add those bright white highlights, but for now, I think the yellow color is enough to give that sort of illusion of depth. And that's looking pretty good to me. And I'm going to take a dry brush with no paint on it, and I'm going to stipple around the edges of these shadows just to blend it out a little bit, make it look a little bit more natural by smoothing that transition between these three different colors. This is an optional step, but the blending I think just helps to make it a little bit more natural. And I'm just tapping on the areas where the color looks especially blobby or concentrated. And in between, I am cleaning off my brush just so I don't mix that paint, those paint colors too much. And that looks pretty good to me. So we're going to move on. The next thing we are going to do is highlight the body of the fish. So we have added shading and highlights to our scales. Now we are going to go back in, now the body's a little bit drier, we're going to go back in and add the shading to the body of the fish. If you're wondering, if you're following along with the instructions at home, everybody should have received a printout, everyone that got a kit. I did switch these steps. In the handout, we went in and we painted the body first. Typically, I would recommend that, but because I got a lot of blue in the tail, I wanted to wait until this dried a little bit so that we can add some more of that gray back here before we start our shading. Because once we put the shading down, we don't really want to keep touching up the body of the fish. We'll just end up knocking out the shading that we put in. So I'm going to go in, clean up the tail just a bit by adding some more of that gray color and just getting a better base to start from. There, and you can see I'm just covering up that excess blue from the water earlier. Alright, and now that that looks good, we can go ahead and start shading. So you remember we kind of put down a medium, sorry, not medium, but like a cool blue. So on the edges, we're going to go even darker. We're going to add some more blue and a little bit more orange to the color that we add to the edges. And then in the center, we're going to move towards pure white, but we are not going to put down any actual pure white yet. We're going to save that really white color for the highlights of the scale at the very end. So I'm going to start by mixing up a darker color. So I'm taking that body color that's still on my palette from the fish earlier, that cool blue, cool gray blue, and I'm adding a little bit more blue and a little bit more orange to it just to get a slightly darker cool gray. And we can take this color and just run it along the edges of our fish to shade it a little bit. Oh, okay, so I put it down and it looks good on my palette, but as soon as I touch it to my canvas, I'll make that a little bigger so you can see. I can tell that this is too warm, too much orange. So I'm going to go back in with some more blue and some more white and try to get that to be cooler. We just want this color to be a darker version of the white that we've already put down. We don't want it to be a new color, if that makes any sense. We're looking for a new shade of this color, not a different color completely. Ah, that looks so much better. It's still a little bit gray, but it looks better. I'm going to blend it with my finger just a bit, just to knock some of that out. We'll try one more time. Third time's a charm, right? All right. Take all the time you need to mix colors. I think getting the right color is very important, especially when it comes to shading. There's nothing, ooh, there's some orange. There's nothing worse than an unnatural looking shadow. And one of the best ways to avoid that is by getting your shading colors right the first time. So there we go. We've got this nice dark or darker cool blue color. And we're just painting this. I painted this along most of the tail and then bringing it up the edges of the body of the fish, all the way along the sides, just where the gray is showing, and even up towards the nose. And I am painting this as a smooth line. We'll go in and we will add a little bit of stippling just to blend it later, but we're going to actually add scale details on top of this, so I'm not too worried about this blending completely at this stage. But yeah, we're just blending this out right now with a clean brush. And then once we get the shading how we like it, we're going to come back in with a little bit of highlights. Now again, we're not going in with pure white. I'm taking a little bit of that body color that we used earlier, that cool gray, and I'm adding a little bit of white to it so we get a lighter version of it, but we're still not looking for pure white. And this is a lot lighter, but I promise you it's not pure white. You'll be able to tell the difference when we do eventually go back in with white to add those highlights to the top of the fish, but you can see how much brighter it is on our canvas than that first shade of gray we went in with. And I am stippling this now right to the center of the fish in those areas where the orange scales are. All right, and then I'm gonna, with a dry, clean brush, just kind of work this out to the edges and stippling it just so that it blends together with those shading colors we had earlier. And you can see we've started to get this illusion of a curved fish where the edges sort of taper down into the water and the top pops up at us, the viewer. All right, once you're happy with the shading on your fish, we can move on to the next step, which is adding in the fins. So earlier I touched upon translucency. If we look at our photo of the fish, our reference photo, you can see that the fins and the tail fins of our fish, they're translucent. You can see the water and the bottom of the pond through them. So we're going to go ahead and try to mimic this by using a slightly more translucent, less opaque paint. So I'm going to take that body color that we still have on our palette, and I'm actually going to mix it with a little bit of water. By watering down the paint, we can make it less opaque and a little bit more transparent. This is something you can do with watercolors as well. It works especially well with watercolors. Watercolors are designed to be translucent, and you build up opacity as you gradually layer them on. Okay. So what I did just now, I went in and I put the line right on top of the shadow. If you remember, the shadow is supposed to be a little bit up and to the left of where we want our actual fin to be. So I need to make the shadow down into the, I need to make the actual fin down into the right. So the actual fin should start somewhere around here. And it should follow the shape of that fin quite closely. I'm going to put another one right on the other side of the fish. And these don't have to be mirror images of one another. They can be. Fish often use their fins in tandem, but just like your arms, they can go different directions. So don't get too hung up on making them identical. They're sisters, not twins, I guess is a good way to think of it. So there's our main line of our fin, and then coming off of that, I'm adding a little bit more water to my brush just to get it slightly more opaque. I'm going to go ahead and paint in the body of that fin, the bulk of it. And you can see I'm doing my best to keep it translucent so that you can still see the water that we painted beneath it. That blue comes through in a way that it really doesn't on the body of the fish, which is much more opaque. And then while it's still wet, I'm just going to go in probably with the back of my brush actually. Let's see, yeah, and I'm going to draw some lines, or scratch I guess is a better word. Scratch some lines into the fin of the fish here. If you want to copy this technique, you want to do it while the paint is still quite wet. And because this is so thin, it's going to dry fairly quickly. So you do need to be a little tricky. Sorry, you do need to be a little quick. It's tricky. If you don't want to do that, you can take your thin brush. If you don't want to scratch it, you can add detail by coming in with a more opaque white and just painting very thin lines along the edge of the fish's fins. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Now we're going to kind of repeat the process with the tail fins. And same as before, if these are up and to the left, we want the actual fins to be down and to the right. So going in with a watered down version of that cool gray body color, we're going to paint the fins mimicking the shape we made before for the shadow. And again, always just consulting our reference image to make sure that we are painting something realistic looking for our fish. If your fin is more opaque, less transparent than you would like, you can always come back in with either a dry brush or a wet brush and sort of lift some of that pigment off of the canvas. And same as before, I'm going to use the back of my brush to scratch in some lines. And that's a pretty nice looking fin, so we'll leave that there. The next thing we're going to do is paint in the dorsal fin. So if you look at our reference photo, the dorsal fin starts right behind the bottom of the fins, and it heads down, stopping almost all the way down here at the tail. And the dorsal fin, because it's high, it's sticking up out of the fish, it is one of the lightest parts of the fish's body. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to use that highlight color to start with. So that was our base body color of the fish mixed with white. I'm going to paint the largest part of the dorsal fin. I'm going to start at the back and work my way forward because I'm moving, you can see as I stroke my brush, I'm trying to move with the natural movement of my wrist. Because I'm right-handed, it makes sense for me to start back here and then paint up. And because this isn't pure white, we can actually continue to build this color brighter and add highlights. Before I do that though, I'm going to go ahead and feather out the edges of this dorsal fin. I'm going to make my dorsal fin kind of flow to the, I guess if we're flow to the top of the fish's body, top of our canvas at least. And again, I'm not using too much paint because this fin, like the other fins, is also a little bit transparent. So I want to use less pigment to kind of suggest that translucency. And it's not very obvious on the white body of the fish, but up here by the scales you can definitely tell that you can see the scales through the dorsal fin. So we've gone ahead and we've laid in the dorsal fin. Now what we can do, since we reserved that brightest white, we can go in and we can put the brightest white that we have, so that pure white that's still on our canvas, sorry, on our palette, we can paint a very thin line right along the topmost edge of the dorsal fin as a highlight. So very carefully come back in, paint a thin white line. See how important it was that we reserved this brightest white? I think when I was a younger painter, my first instinct when I saw a white fish would have been to go in and just paint the fish white with, the white paint on my canvas. But by starting with that medium cool gray and then working our way up, again, we get this wide range of different values. And these values are what allows us to create depth, to create highlights, to create shadows, and the contrast that really brings our painting to life and helps us understand what we're looking at. So that looks great to me. That's a good dorsal fin. While we have this white, I'm going to actually go in and I'm going to add highlights to the fins that we just painted as well. I think it's going to help them stand out just a little bit more and kind of pop. So I'm going to add this highlight. I'm basing this again off my reference photo, just to the edges of the fish's fin. And if you're wondering, this isn't even the brightest white. This is still just a lighter version of that cool body color. And the reason for that is, if you think, I'm not using the brightest white because I don't want it to be as bright as the white on the top of the fish's body, because the fins of the fish, they're not as close to us as the top of the fish. So we don't want to make this as bright. We want to give it a different value. Oh, that was a lot. It's all right. You can see my go-to when I do something I don't necessarily like. My go-to is to take my finger and tap it out or smudge it out. It works for me. It's not for everyone. But there, now we have a little bit more contrast in those fins. All right. Moving on. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to, I guess we're going to add the eyes and the details to the fish's face. So, depending on your reference photo, you may or may not be able to see the eyes of your fish. I'm going to go ahead, based on the reference photo, place my eye. I think I'm only going to do one eye on this fish. I don't know why. It kind of looks like it's leaning to the left a bit. So I'm going to put one eye right here. And then I'm also going to go in and add just the tiniest little whiskers, because if you look at pictures of koi fish, they do have those cute little whiskers. So again, not using a pure white, using a lighter version of that cool gray body color. I'm going to come in with a little bit of white, and then inside of that white, I'm going to paint. First I'm going to bring back this body color. This is blending into the background too much for me. Alright. I'm going to paint in the black inside of here, the black of the fish's pupil. And I don't want to use a pure black. I think pure black, especially in a painting like this where there is no black, can be kind of jarring. So I'm just going to create a dark blue by mixing that blue with the black. Just like we kind of want to stay away from pure white in our painting and only use it in very select areas to make a statement. Same with the pure black, we kind of want to stay away from it because honestly, true black, if you think about nature and like photography, real black, deep dark, no color, darkest value in our toolbox, it doesn't appear in nature very often. Even if you look in the darkest shadows, usually you can see a little bit of color. Like if you look back into the trees in a forest, even the darkest shadows will be just a really, really dark shade of green. Even if you're looking in the deepest ocean, you'd have to be very, very, very far down to only see true black. Normally you're seeing a very deep shade of blue. So I'm going to go in and just gradually work my way darker as we get towards the center of the eye. And then I'm gonna add a highlight, I think. So I'm gonna use the back of my paintbrush and I'm gonna dip it in that cool blue color, that gray, and I'm gonna give a highlight to the fish's eye. And then the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna paint some whiskers up at the top of the fish's mouth. And little whiskers. And I'm using a cool color blue because these whiskers would be on the bottom of the fish's mouth. So they would be a pretty dark shade of the body color. You can leave these whiskers off. I don't think I did them in my initial painting, but now that I'm looking at the reference photo, I see them and they're kind of cute. So I'm putting mine in. Okay. Those are too thick, but my paintbrush isn't very thin today. So it is what it is. Oh, that made it worse. I'm coming in, if you're wondering, I'm coming in with a little bit of water. I'm just kind of wiping this away, which I can do because the paint underneath has dried. We'll try again. I'm going to use the back of my brush and see if I can get a thinner line that way. Hopefully, I'm using some brushes from our paint kit here, but everybody who got a kit today, you guys have got new brushes. I'm using an old brush, so hopefully you're not having the same struggle I am. But yeah, that looks good to me. Okay, I'm wondering if one eye looks weird. We'll come back to that. I might add another eye later. My initial painting had 2 eyes, so you can always add another eye if you'd like to. But we are on, we're about to finish up the fish. The last thing we want to do here is just add some scales. And this is where, you know, reserving that white is really going to pay off. We're going to come back in with our tiny brush. We're going to add some white scales to the fish. So these scales are just going to be tiny little U shapes or C shapes that go along the side of the fish. And again, because I'm using an old brush and it's driving me crazy, I'm going to draw these in with the back of my pencil. And on the bottom parts of the fish, I'm not using true white. Again, I'm using just a lighter version of that body color. And then I'm going to move towards true white the closer we get to the middle of the fish, that dorsal fin. Again, that's going to help us preserve this illusion of a curved fish, the illusion of depth. And we're just making little C shapes to add some texture and give the appearance of scales. I'm tapping my C's out when I think with my finger. You can see me doing that. just when I think that they look a little bit too jarring and they need to be blended a bit. If you like that look, by all means, leave them as they are. Mine are a little bit, you know, more pronounced because I'm using the back of my brush. If you're using, you know, the bristles of your brush, you might not need to do that. They probably look a little bit more natural. Anyways. So just making different layers of C's. And then we're gonna move, like I said, move towards pure white as we get to the top of the fish. Just adding those bright highlights. And just like we've been adding white highlights to the scale, we can go in and add some gold highlights to the orange scales of our fish. I'm mixing a pale gold color on my palette. I just mixed some yellow, orange, and white together. I'm going to take this color and just add it again to the topmost part of our fish using that C motion. Just trying to create that texture of scales. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that on the microphone. Pardon my stomach. Okay, that looks good. So our fish is finished. It's driving me nuts. I'm going to add another eye, and then our fish is finished. I don't think this is realistic. I haven't seen any reference photos yet where I can see both eyes of the fish. But my monkey brain is going, one-eyed fish. So we're gonna come in and add the other eye back. I guess this is one example of when fantasy trumps reality. If something just looks weird, even if it's in the reference photo, my gut is always to paint it so it looks natural to you. Because if it looks weird to you, it probably looks weird to other people. And then we'll add that highlight in, same as before. All right, cute bug-eyed fish, check. Last thing we're gonna do is we're gonna add some details to our lily pads. And even as they've dried, I still think that these could be a little bit lighter for the base coat. So I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna take some white and some green and a little bit of yellow. I'm just gonna maybe dry brush. I'll dry brush on some of this lighter color. Dry brushing is a technique where you take a little bit of paint on a mostly dry brush and you brush it onto an already dry area of your canvas. And it just gives you an interesting texture. So you can see here, that texture I'm talking about, it kind of almost looks like chalk. So I'm dry brushing this highlight onto the lily pad just to give us a bit of an interesting contrast and also to make it pop a little bit more from the water itself. And then I'm going to take that same color, that same dry brush technique, I'm going to pull that color down here at the bottom lily pad. If you can't get a hang of this dry brushing technique, by all means, you can also just brighten the lily pad up by adding paint to its surface in the usual manner, just loading up your brush completely. But I think this adds a nice effect. And then the last thing we're going to do for these lily pads is we're going to go in and we're going to add some veining. So I'm going to take a slightly darker shade of green. So I'm going to take that Kelly green I'm going to mix a little bit of blue with it. Again, blue's great for making a color cooler, darker, and giving it that shadowed appearance. Let's see how that looks. I don't think I need to add black to this. Nah, that's good. So we just are going to add some green and blue together, and then I'm going to outline the lily pad in this darker color. And then once I do that, then I'll add some veining to the lily pad. Again, these lines aren't going to be as thin as I'd like them to be because of my brush, but hopefully you can get, you know, more graceful, skinny lines as you do this. But I'm just going to paint very lightly, just little lines on our lily pad to give the illusion of veins. You know, plants have vascular systems too. And in a water aquatic plant like a lily pad, that's much more apparent. So that looks nice. We'll do the same thing to the bottom lily pad. I'm going to mix up a little bit more of that dark green, and just come on in and paint some fine veins. And just like that, we are finished. I hope you guys had a wonderful time painting today. I sure did. If you didn't know, we are in the middle of our summer reading program. This year our theme is Tails and Tales, which is why we were painting this very cute little fish today. If you haven't already, make sure that you stop by the library and fill out your 10-hour reading sheet to win one of these beautiful tote bags. And continue reading along with us to be entered into grand prize readings all summer. The program goes from now until August 6th. I look forward to seeing you again in September with another Mocktails and Masterpieces class.